Well, hello, and thanks for joining me today for episode 5 of season 2 of the Healthy Skeptic MD podcast. I'm Dr. Michael Hockman. Today, we're going to continue our discussion of key common medical decisions that many of us will need to consider at one point or another in our lives. My guest today is a physician, thought leader, podcaster, author, all of the above, Dr. Vinay Prasad. He's an oncologist at the University of California, San Francisco. And we're going to focus today on genomic medicine. Everything from direct-to-consumer genetic tests to assess cancer risk to precision medicine, which is using genes to guide therapy. Vinay is someone who's thought quite a lot about this, both the pros and the cons, and he's going to explain why the genomic revolution has been slower to accrue to us than many of us had predicted. Vinay also has some really important thoughts about COVID-19 and the trajectory of the pandemic, and also some of the critique he has received for speaking his mind on very important issues, and in my view, very reasonable perspectives. So do stick around for that. If you find today's episode engaging and interesting, please search and subscribe to the Healthy Skeptic MD wherever you listen to podcasts, on YouTube. Please share with friends and family and others who might be interested. And if you do have a chance, please do consider leaving a review. Okay, so before we jump into our conversation with Vinay, as always, I want to start with a quick rundown of the health news for the week. And the first item I'd like to mention is the tricky decision about when to reopen schools in the midst of this pandemic. It's a topic we've covered a fair amount already in this podcast, but it was again in the news this week here locally in Los Angeles. So for the 1.5 million LA school children since March, the vast majority have not gone back for even a single day of in-person instructions. And my own kids are in that category as well. Now, this week, a group of about 1,500 pediatricians as part of the local chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics issued a statement calling for schools to work towards immediate reopening. This is certainly a very nuanced discussion. There's arguments that are very reasonable and appropriate on both sides of the equation. But as I've said in the past, the more we get data, the more it seems that the health benefits to students and their parents of reopening schools, the psychological, mental, and physical health benefits outweigh the risks of viral spread. Of course, if there are surges, there's always the possibility of temporarily reclosing schools. So it's nice to see some other medical leaders taking that position, and hopefully we can work towards reopening schools safely, not just here in Los Angeles, but around the country. And I'll just make a quick plug. My sister-in-law, Marissa Leitner, has also started a petition calling for a commitment of a reopening date. I'm going to post that on my social media accounts. If you do have a chance, check it out and consider signing on to that. So the next news item I want to mention is the growing momentum for the COVID-19 vaccination strategy of getting as many first doses of the vaccine into people as quickly as possible. In other words, prioritizing that first dose. Now, that does not mean that the second dose is not necessary. That second dose is still going to be really important for ensuring a strong and lasting immune response. But what it does mean is that our priority should be getting the first dose into people, even if it does mean that some people are not going to get that second dose right on time. Now, what's interesting here is that just a couple of weeks ago, this was almost blasphemy in the medical community. And this week, the Biden administration actually endorsed it as the preferred strategy. Now, from my perspective, it does seem to make a lot of sense, even if there are arguments on both sides of the equation here. But in my perspective, it does seem intuitive. And so I think it is a noteworthy development that it's now the endorsed strategy for vaccinations. The next news item I want to mention is that the Biden administration made a big investment this week in the Outweigh home test. This is the COVID-19 test that would be directly marketed to consumers. You do it at home, get an immediate result, very similar to a home pregnancy test. I had a nice discussion about this topic with Christina Fiore last week from MedPage Today. And the idea here is that this could be part of a strategy to test most Americans several times per week as a way to help safely reopen the economy. And it's a very interesting, noteworthy idea. But there are some cautions, as I discussed with Christina. And the biggest of those is that these tests are far, far from perfect. As I always tell my patients, a test is one piece of information, but if it doesn't match with the rest of the picture, it may lead us astray. And in particular, my concern here is that if people have symptoms, for example, and they get a negative test, they're going to have a false sense of security, which could actually backfire and cause more exposures and more spread than without the test at all. So this will definitely be something to keep a close eye on as we get more data about this strategy. Finally, I wanted to touch on a question I've been getting from more and more of my patients, and that is, what if I've already had COVID-19? Do I still need to get the vaccine? So the short answer is yes, but there was some interesting data on this from a very well-respected immunologist, Florian Kramer at Mount Sinai in New York. And his lab found that for those who have previously had an infection, that one single dose of the vaccine triggers a very strong immune response. So this is preliminary data, can't draw any conclusions yet, but that would certainly be encouraging for those of you who have already had COVID-19, that maybe, depending on how the data hold up, you'll be able to get away with one vaccine instead of two. So that's it for the news summary this week. Let's jump into our interview with Dr. Vinay Prasad. Well, welcome to the show, Dr. Vinay Prasad.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, so just to start us out, you are an oncologist at the University of California, San Francisco. Can you just tell us a little bit about the practice that patients you take care of?
Sure. Well, I guess I'm very new here. So I started in May. I moved in the middle of the pandemic. And my practice is slightly different than what it was before. So when I was in Oregon, I was a faculty member at the Oregon Health and Science University for 5 years, and I took care of it. It was really sort of all over the place. I mean, I had a day a week where I did lymphoma clinic. Another day a week I spent doing head and neck cancer and lung cancer. And I used to attend on a variety of services, from classical hematology to the leukemia service to bone marrow transplant to a little bit of solid tumor over the years. And I've even attended with the general medicine residents, the chief residents on their teaching service. In the new job, it's a little bit more focused. I'm doing classical hematology and heme malignancies in my clinical time. So I run an outpatient clinic in that. And then I attend on both services, heme and onc, for a couple months a year.
And do you do a mix of research and clinical work?
Yeah, so I do about a day a week in clinic, and the rest of the time research, and I do about 2 months a year of service. At least that's what it'll shake out to be once the world reopens. And the rest of the time I do research in health policy, evidence-based medicine, a lot of the themes that fit your podcast. I consider myself a healthy skeptic, not a cynic, but a skeptic.
Well, I think that's a good way of saying it. And I've been a big fan of yours for a long time. And I think we have a very similar philosophy, less is more in many cases.
Absolutely.
Well, in addition to the clinical work and the research that you do, you are also a writer, a thought leader. You have a podcast called Plenary Session, which I would strongly commend to any of my listeners. But most recently, you've written a couple books. The first one has to do with a common saying in medical school that half of what you learn is going to be wrong, and we don't know which half that is. So the title of the book was Ending Medical Reversal. Could you just tell us a little bit about that book?
Yeah, so that was a book that is sort of the capstone of a lot of efforts we've been doing in a number of papers on medical reversal, which are all those things we do in medicine year in, year out. We think we're benefiting patients, and later it turns out not that they're replaced by something better, but they're no better than if we hadn't done it at all. And if we had done the thing we were doing before, that was actually just as good or better than what we're doing now. So they are really the flip-flops of medicine. They're the errors, the missteps. And we've cataloged them. We note that they occur with a certain frequency. That frequency is rather high. It's rather scary. And in that book, we try to get to the bottom of it. Why do reversals keep happening? Even though science is always getting better, the rate of reversals doesn't appear to be going down and down. It's staying where it is. So what's going on there?
Yeah, well, I always say, you don't want to be a late adopter, but sometimes it's not the best to be an early adopter, because so many of these new treatments or new ideas don't end up panning out.
No, I think that's just very true, which is the classic saying, you don't want to be the first doctor to do something, you don't want to be the last, you want to be in the middle.
Yeah, well, I think it's great philosophy to have, and patients should have that philosophy too. You don't always necessarily need to feel like you're missing out. Maybe it's even a good thing in some cases if you're not the first one to try out a new drug or treatment, whatever that may be. Well, you just wrote another book, this one more focused on cancer. It's titled Malignant: How Bad Policy and Bad Evidence Harm People with Cancer. In this one, you got into some more of the policy issues and the financial incentives that drive, in some cases, bad care. Could you just briefly tell everyone about this one?
Malignant, the second book, is about cancer medicine, so it's about sort of all that I know about cancer medicine. I think I'm really interested in why we're approving these drugs, the benefit the drugs provide, why do they cost so much? And I think that these separate strands are really woven together. The reason they don't work that well is tied to why they cost so much, and is tied to the standard for approval, and is tied to why there's so many of them in the pipeline. In other words, we're willing to pay any amount of money for them. We have a low regulatory hurdle to come to the market, so the industry is incentivized to chase these drugs even when they have lackluster early trial data. And so I think it's an ecosystem. We've created the conditions for marginal cancer drugs. We can't act surprised that these cancer drugs, on average, deliver modest benefits. And I'll give you a statistic. Out of 71 consecutive drugs approved for solid cancers, the average benefit was 2.1 months. That isn't as good as I want for my patients. That's beneath what I want. I want better. I want years of benefit from these drugs. I think everyone wants that.
Yeah, I read a book a number of years ago by Marcia Angel about the drug industry, and she used to write about Me Too drugs that are just marginally better, marginally different, and they add 2 extra months of life, or they make your LDL, your bad cholesterol, a couple points lower, but they're not really frame shift type breakthroughs. And, I think that was a key point that came through in your book with cancer drugs.
Yeah. And The Truth About Drug Companies, I think that was the 2004
that was the title
book
of
by
it.
Marcia Angel. Yep. Yeah. I highly recommend that book. And you also have to think about where Dr. Angel was when she wrote this book. She had just been her helm of editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine. She had seen for decades the ways in which the industry was trying to use the journal and its masthead and its legacy to promote their products. And so in the wake of that, she cataloged a number of her experiences and a number of interesting case studies in that book. And I think it's sort of a seminal book in this space. Yeah, people should read it.
Okay, so I want to focus today with you on the topic of genetic testing. But before we do, I have one last question. You've been in the news a lot this week, and curious your thoughts. You wrote a piece for MedPage today, and you wrote about the possibility that we could maybe be a little bit more relaxed about some of the precautions once the vaccine comes out. So I'm just going to quote exactly what you said here. You said, "For most people, once you get 14 days out of your second dose of the vaccine, I believe you can ease up on masking or another restriction such as visiting a loved one for lunch or having more than one person visit a nursing home." I do a lot of geriatrics care, and gosh, there's so many people who are isolated. You said also possibly small gatherings of vaccinated people for dinner without, heaven forbid, masks. I generally agree with that, but I just would love to hear your case. Make the case to us about why you said that.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to do that. I guess I'd say this is a live question right now. More and more people, it's still a small number, but it's going to be more and more. Every day is going to be more and more people getting vaccinated, and they need some guidance as to what that means for them. And I guess I'd say there's, at least 3 strands of evidence that come from the vaccine studies. We can run through them. So one is, you hear all the time that Moderna and Pfizer, the 2 mRNA vaccines that have emergency use authorization in the United States, are good vaccines. They are. They're really damn good. And you know what? I was blown away by how good they were. I'll admit I was surprised when I saw how good they were. They're 95% relative risk reduction, which means that the difference between the 2 arms from a relative standpoint is a 95% reduction in risk. That's one way to measure the vaccine efficacy. But the way I like to measure, and I talked about in the article, was if you've gotten both doses and you go an additional 14 days without symptoms, what's your subsequent probability of developing SARS-CoV-2, symptomatic SARS-CoV-2, the primary point of the study? And by this metric acknowledges the fact that some of the diagnoses in the vaccine arm occur between dose 1 and 2. So that's not relevant to the patient who's gone 14 days after dose 2 and they've still felt fine. From that moment in time to the future, what's their probability? And the answer is, in Pfizer, 99.95% chance you're not going to get symptomatic SARS-CoV-2. In Moderna, 99.92%. And we just got a press release yesterday from Israel suggesting that if you get both doses of Pfizer and go 7 days, there is a 0.01% chance you're going to get SARS-CoV-2 in this sort of real-world experiment. In other words, the vaccine is exquisitely potent, and particularly potent in people who have cleared that hurdle. The next line of evidence I would offer is severe COVID-19. Severe COVID-19 is the reason why we even talk about COVID-19. If COVID-19 didn't have that very severe state that resulted in hospitalization and death, it would just be a coronavirus you would never even know about, right? So it's the severe that we care about. This vaccine, it crushes severe COVID-19. There are 0 cases out of 14,000 plus people in Moderna. There's 1 case in Pfizer, and I haven't read the full case report. I want to know more about it. So the thing that you really care about it is crushing the third line of evidence, asymptomatic or PCR detected COVID-19. People worry that I can be vaccinated, perhaps I am still at risk. In the Mrna trial, when they swabbed people's nasopharynx on dose 2, there was a 60% reduction in PCR detection. The raw rate of PCR detection was 1 in 1,000. This vaccine looks like it's knocking down viral detection by PCR, and that doesn't necessarily mean infectivity. That's just detecting virus on PCR. The last piece of evidence, which is kind of circumstantial, which is that the monoclonal antibodies by Regeneron and Lilly, they do clear the nasal passages of virus faster. So you put this all together, exquisite vaccine making neutralizing antibodies, priming the body's immune response, crushing severe COVID, clearing asymptomatic disease. This vaccine is protective both for the user and it's likely clearing the nasal passages very quickly when people are exposed to virus. Okay, so this is kind of one chunk of the argument. This is a damn good vaccine. The next chunk of the argument is these precautions that we've instituted. We have to be a little bit honest. Wearing a cloth mask, I do it. It makes sense for unvaccinated people to do. But what data exists that supports its use in vaccinated people? I mean, that's a leap of faith. It may provide some theoretical relative risk reduction. But as you take absolute risk in biomedicine and you drop it to 0 or near 0, as we're doing here, does it confer an additional benefit? I'm holding up my cloth mask to prove to you that I love wearing it. I actually do love it. I mean, I'm drawn to the anonymity it provides me on the street. I really do. Actually, not mind it at all.
Yours is a very nice color, I must say.
It's a lovely shade of red. I have them in all colors now, to be honest with you. I've accessorized, and I found one with really comfortable over the ear. Anyway, this is a sidetrack, but I mean, it's to say that, I have no animosity towards this mask. In fact, I quite like it. However, in this case, I think the risk of this person, the delta on wearing a mask is absolutely uncertain. And so I think that's one reason to be cautious. The next thing is, to be honest with you, I don't think people are even craving throwing away the mask. That's not what really is hurting our soul. Wearing the mask is like I wear pants. It's not a big deal. What's hurting our soul, I think, is that we don't get to hug our mothers. We don't get to have dinner with people that we know. If two vaccinated people want to have dinner together from unrelated households, I think medically, what case can you make? I don't understand. What case can you make that they oughtn't to do that? Other than, well, we don't want to send the wrong message. But that's not a medical case. That's a public messaging case. We could talk about that. That's sort of another part of the article where I talk about these sort of social considerations. The last point I'll make to you, because I'm talking too long, the last point I'll make to you is, I'm an oncologist who's attended on bone marrow transplant service for many, many, many years. And on bone marrow transplant service, you learn there are people who are getting bone marrow transplant and they have a range of human desires. They want to hug their grandkids. They want to love, they want to touch somebody. They want to be close to somebody, but they're afraid. They've just had a bone marrow transplant. Their immune system's not 100%. So what do we tell this person? Do we tell this person, damn it, don't touch anybody, never touch anybody until we tell you it's safe? Or do we tell them that, there are risks in life and life is not a zero-risk game and we need to find a balance in terms of reasonable risks that we can all accept but preserve the things in life we value? And so when you come back to this question, the reason I wrote my article is because I believe that a reasonable person can look at that vaccine data, and if they know it the way I know it and the way I articulated it to you, they can look at it and say, I'm willing to take this very tiny theoretical chance to hug my grandmother or hug my mother that I haven't hugged in a year. And if they're to do that, I'll quote Pope Francis, who am I to judge? I'm not in the judging business, and I'm not that person to judge. And then the last thing I'd say, the reason this article has generated such backlash against me, which I find deeply inappropriate, because some of the things people say are like that I'm somehow in the business of wanting bad things to happen to people. I'm not, it turns out I'm not in that business. I don't profit from bad things happening to people. I'm in the business of thinking about risk and risk perception for a long time now. And I'm also not in the business of signaling to anyone that I have an allegiance to any tribe or any virtuous act. And I fear that some of this messaging has taken on a life of its own. If you tell two vaccinated people who have been asymptomatic after dose 2 for 14 days that they are not allowed to have dinner together alone, I struggle to understand where that comes from a medical standpoint. I view that as a form of religion, of virtue signaling over all else. I find it irrational. I don't know why anyone would recommend such a thing. And yet on Twitter, people say exactly that. After 2 doses of vaccination, even if you're asymptomatic, nothing should be different. That's a mantra I hear. Nothing should be different. And I think that's just not honest. Last thing I'd say, Europe has a whole different attitude. They have posters in Europe that show people saying, why am I getting vaccinated? And it says, I want to hug my grandkids. And I listened to NPR this morning, and they have some nurse talking about how people are coming in weeping to get vaccinated, saying, I want to hug my grandkids. So, people want this. This is a part of life. And to say that nothing should be different, I think, is an untenable proposition that is medically incorrect.
Well, I just want to tell you genuinely how refreshing it is to hear a very well-respected medical professional talk the way you are.
Formerly well-respected. because now they're like, screw this guy. That's what they say. That's what they say. I'm not joking. They really are. It's not a climate to dissent from popular narratives. But thank you for saying that.
Well, you certainly have many people on your side, and sometimes it's a loud few who make you feel that way. One thing that we've talked about on this podcast is that we have underappreciated the downside of some of the measures we've taken with this virus, the lack of social interaction and the harms that has on people's health. So if we have a vaccine that, as you said, is 99, I haven't even heard it that compelling as you have, even 95% effective, for two people to not be able to have lunch together to get the health benefits, the social benefits of doing that, I'm sold on that. I will go down on the record as saying I'm 100% behind you. And in terms of the mask, I agree with you. That's less of an issue for me. But to say that we need to keep the world closed down, keep small businesses shut, keep grandparents and their grandchildren after the vaccine is out, to me that doesn't make any sense. So I will go on the record right there behind you.
Thanks.
Would love to talk about this more, but this season of The Healthy Skeptic, we're focusing on key medical decisions that everyone should be aware of. And you've written so much about the role of genetic testing. And this is both to identify people who are at high risk for developing a condition like cancer, and then also for people who have a disease like cancer to help tailor the therapy. It's sometimes called precision medicine. Could you just tell us about how genetic tests are being used for screening for cancer?
Genetics has been, thought to be incredibly important in cancer since the Human Genome Project. So we've been dealing with this for about 20 years. And there were many sort of bold claims made about what genetics will lead to and what it won't lead to. I think that in cancer medicine, we deal with it in several buckets. And we can maybe talk about the buckets. One, the bucket of somebody who has cancer. Let's look at the genetic mutations in that tumor and what can we do to fight this cancer, or quote unquote fight this cancer, or a word I don't like, or do something to treat this cancer. The next bucket is, and this is a bucket that's being explored as we speak, which is there a way to draw blood from somebody and look for mutational aberrations to predict who's going to develop cancer down the road? Can we find that cancer and cut it out? The classic sort of screening test, and companies like Grail are doing that. And then there's a third thing that I think you're talking about, which is like who should undergo genetic testing for cancer. And I guess I would say it's a little bit out of my workshop, and of course we have genetic counselors for this, but I think the things in my mind are strong family histories of cancer, strong family histories of breast, prostate, pancreas. You want to look in groups of people where it's likely that you're going to find something. There are some people out there who recently argue that, we should just screen everybody indiscriminately with BRCA screening. I think there's a prominent proponent of that in the University of Washington. And I guess I would say that when you start getting to that level, when you start saying we ought to do this to everybody, a blanket recommendation for some genomic screening, then I and people like me might say the bar of evidence has got to go up from just consensus and probabilistic considerations to sort of proof that those sorts of strategies are making people better off.
Right. And they always say in medicine that when you send a test, you ought to know what you're going to do with that information. So a lot of times you'll get a result and you'll say someone's at increased risk because of a certain genetic mutation or finding that they have. But the question is, does that translate into, do we screen them more aggressively for cancer? And will that actually lead to better health outcomes for them, quality of life, helping them live longer? And for the vast majority of these genetic tests, I think it's fair to say that has not been proven. Would you agree?
I would agree with you wholeheartedly. I mean, in the ocean of genetic tests that a healthy individual can get, many of them, I would say two things are uncertain. One, the precise probability that somebody with that genomic alteration will develop malignancy X or cardiovascular disease Y or neurologic disease Z, whatever you want. The precise probability is often far more uncertain than is stated. I mean, because we don't always have that large scale epidemiologic evidence to tell you, plus or minus 10 percentage points, what's the chance? That's one thing. But for some, I think it's quite good. Certain mutations in BRCA really high lifetime probability of getting breast and ovarian cancer. I mean, super, super high. So I want to say that there's some that really are quite good. But for most, I think they're modest. When you get modest genomic results, it's a pickle. It's a real pickle. You're anxious, you're nervous, you're thinking about it, it looms on you, it sits on your shoulder. But what do you do about it? And it's intuitive and plausible, and in fact, everyone will recommend keep an eye on it, which means more scans, and more scanxiety, more scan anxiety, more worry about it, and not necessarily knowing that you'll be better off as a result. Now, the BRCA story I think is interesting because I think a credible case can be made in women with the family history and with those alterations that you can do something proactively, and that proactive thing would be bilateral prophylactic mastectomy and oophorectomy and removal of the fallopian tubes after one has completed childbearing to one's satisfaction, after one has all the kids that one wishes. But it's a tough choice, and I think of course we're all familiar with the Angelina Jolie effect. I don't know if you're going to talk about this.
No, go ahead. I actually did not have Angelina Jolie on my list of questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a paper by my colleague Anupam Jena a few years ago in the British Medical Journal, but it talked about how, Angelina Jolie came forward very publicly and very bravely, I think, with her own story about identifying BRCA mutations and what she did proactively. But it led to a lot. I mean, it really did change people's practices.
And one thing you have written about the BRCA mutation is there are some companies now that have FDA clearance to do direct-to-consumer testing without a doctor being involved and maybe those genetic counselors not having an opportunity to educate people. Are you concerned about that, the direct-to-consumer advertising?
Yeah, I guess I am. I'm concerned about it in all these domains. And I want to kind of articulate my concerns on this. I mean, there are many aspects of the American medical system that I think are terrific. We do have many innovative products and we do get them out pretty quickly. But one of the things we have in America is we have more direct-to-consumer medicine of all sorts. Direct-to-consumer advertisement of prescription drug products, which is, to my knowledge, remains legally only the case in two nations, the U.S. and New Zealand, and not everywhere else on Earth. We have increasingly disease awareness campaigns. So a company may make a very costly product for a certain type of disease, and then they run a campaign for disease awareness. Awareness means ask your doctor about, whatever, the thing that they make the drug for, or they make the product for. And the problem is in medicine is some of these diagnoses are not rock solid. But if the companies really dig deeper and deeper and push people to be more inquisitive, it's possible that on the margins, and we have a paper coming out on this soon in the Mayo Clinic proceedings, it's possible on the margins you identify people with those alterations, those laboratory abnormalities, who were not destined to develop clinical disease. And so, of course, the company's perverse interest is it'll drive up their market share. But my interest is, are we making people better off? Now to your question, direct-to-consumer genomics. I think it's a real Pandora's box. In many respects, after Human Genome Project, many people feared that, I would open the envelope one day. I sent my saliva, direct-to-consumer, I sent my saliva, I opened the envelope, and the envelope says something like, oh, you have a 42% risk of Parkinson's in the next year, or you have a 32% risk of MI. I think, and many people thought, what would you do with that information if you had it? But I think the sobering aspect of Human Genome Project and all the work that's happened the last decade is that the genome is not as much destiny as we thought. And we're actually not so good at telling you all these precise things. And things that we thought, if you can go back, I'm pretty sure there's a Francis Collins editorial that said, the doctor of 2010, I think it was the doctor of 2010 or maybe 2015. The doctor of 2010, he's not just going to give you a lisinopril or hydrochlorothiazide. He's going to sequence you. He's going to say, for you benefit from valsartan, and that didn't happen. We don't do that. We give everyone the same hypertensive.
My first day at medical school, my dean said 20 years from now, which is about now, 2021, when I started, doctors' roles are going to be very different. It's going to be computers that make all the day-to-day decisions. All we're going to be doing is overseeing it. So, so a lot of these predictions have not panned out.
Yeah, the rumors of my death are grossly overstated, exactly. As a wise man said. Yeah, I think they haven't panned out. I think you're right. Anyway, to connect it back to your question, I think the only reason why I guess folks like me haven't written more about direct-to-consumer genomic testing is that there simply are not as many genetic loci that tell you strongly one thing or the other. There are a few. And there is, to your point directly, there is an opportunity for misunderstanding, for misuse. More information is not always better, and more information can lead you astray. The right information at the right time is what makes medicine, and it's something we forget. So that's why I think, just letting people have at it with genomics, direct-to-consumer genomics, it's not the path to the wisest decisions. It's the path to profitability, to everyone having a startup company, which is a goal in America, but it's not the path to population health and even sound individual medical decisions in my mind.
You are an oncologist. You see people with a diagnosis of cancer. Perhaps one area where genomics has started to have a little bit more of an impact is after the diagnosis has been made to help guide the appropriate therapy. I think that's often termed precision medicine. What does precision medicine mean to you, and have you used it with any of your patients yet?
Great question. So I guess I would say, one thing I want to say up front is that some people call this personalized medicine. And the truth is, medicine has always been personalized. Since 4,000 years ago, there's no doctor who comes in and just does something. They always take into account the unique situations and circumstances. And even prior to genomics, we always did. We want to know who we were seeing and where they were from and what they can tolerate and how their other problems were. We always are in the personalized business. But precision, I think, goes the next step. It's what you're talking about. It's the use of, I would define it as the use of genetics or other omics, which is anything from transcriptome to proteome to metabolome, other omics to guide clinical decisions. That's what I think it means. And in oncology, we love the idea. There are hundreds and perhaps thousands, tens of thousands of papers written about precision oncology. But to your question, how often do oncologists, when they see a patient, use genomic information to make therapeutic choices? When I started in this business as faculty back in 2015, so not that long ago, it was an open question. No one had estimated that number. If you would go to national conferences, people spoke in exalting terms about genome oncology. A couple years ago, I was part of a pro-con debate about the values of genomic oncology, and we ran a project where we estimated it. So we looked through all the, we got the list of all the cancers that Americans suffer from: prostate, lung, colorectal, breast, ovarian, the common ones, and then all the other ones, from Hodgkin's lymphoma to salivary gland cancer, all the cancers. And for each of these cancers, we looked through and we said, how often does a genomic test guide treatment? So in lung cancer, 15% EGFR, or 2%, 4% ALK, and then we went through cancer by cancer. And at the end of it, when you multiply the frequency of the tumor by the frequency of the mutation and look at the drugs, we came to the conclusion that was something like 9% of US cancer patients have a therapy that's guided by, or where it's a drug that hits a genomic target. It's the drug, it's a lock and key. And we published that in JAMA Oncology. And I think it's, in retrospect, in the field, people cite it as if it's true. But at the time, it was quite provocative. I think it really challenged conventional wisdom, which probably would have put it at a much higher number.
So pretty modest. I even would have thought it was higher than that. That's interesting how low it is. Are there any instances you can think of where that information has led us astray, where precision medicine has had some unintended negative consequences?
Absolutely. How much time do you have? I guess I would say there are several examples of it. Some of these genomic mutations, we still don't really know for sure if giving you the key for the lock is better than giving you the old standard. So there's one drug called selpercatinib. It's for patients with RET, rearrangement transfection, non-small cell lung cancer. Quite a mouthful, but let's just say new drug for really rare mutation lung cancer. And it was approved because this drug generates tumor shrinkage in X percentage of people. And that X percentage looks better than the average lung cancer patient getting average treatment. But this is not the average lung cancer patient. This is someone with rearranged lung cancer, very rare type. So what does that average treatment look like in that population? And so we spent a lot of time, and you can read our paper. It's on selpercatinib. It's in the Annals of Oncology. And we make a case that actually there is still equipoise. Like, you could randomize people to the old treatment or the new treatment. You really don't know which one's better. And the European Medicines Agency felt similarly. They asked the company to do this. That's one example. there are many anecdotal stories of doctors who have patients who send their tumors for these sequencing. And the patient comes in and they have a tumor and a mutation for which there is no FDA-approved drug for that mutation in that cancer, but it is approved in a different cancer. And they ask the doctor, well, give me that drug instead of the standard of care. And it's so easy and plausible and seductive to think that those choices always make people better off. But it's honest and necessary to think the possibility that those choices actually make people worse off. And sometimes you give that targeted drug in that person, and they do worse than had they done with the older treatment. And so the answer to your question is almost assuredly the answer is a yes, that there are situations where you can be seduced by genomics and give a treatment that is inferior to standard of care treatment. And a lot of my publications have been to try to articulate that. But even that proposition is a dangerous idea in oncology. I mean, even that proposition, if you were to survey 100 oncologists, you would find very little appetite for that proposition. It is a heretical proposition. And so I think the goal of some of our work is to try to take something that is almost surely true and make it something that we can talk about soberly. Yeah.
Okay, but pick up on that. I want to ask you a little bit of a crystal ball question. I think a lot of people would agree with you that the pace of precision medicine has been slower than many would have hoped. But I think it was about 5 years ago, President Obama committed to redoubling our effort. And, there were all sorts of claims that over the next couple decades, so maybe, even up 10 or 15 years ahead of now, precision medicine is going to transform healthcare. It's going to improve outcomes and make us live longer, healthier, higher quality, less expensive because we'll focus our resources where they're most needed. So crystal ball, 10 or 15 years from now, do you have share that optimism about precision medicine?
I guess I would say that, I guess I would say that if you talk about precision medicine, like what will the genome tell us? I guess I would say there are some reasons to be optimistic. We're going to learn a lot more about pediatric tumors, about rare cancers. I suspect that some of them are driven by very preserved genomic alterations like fusion events, and that those events will be druggable and you might get some good outcomes. In our study of the genomic use of drugs over time, we plotted out over time, and it looked like every year it goes up about 1% per year. 1% per year better than it was the year before. At 1% per year, to get to 100%, it's going to take 100 years. It's a slow uphill climb. I suspect it will stay on that trajectory. And in fact, every piece of data I've seen from work we're doing suggests we're still on that trajectory. We're going to stay on that trajectory. But we may sometimes start to peak off and plateau. There may be some common cancers, some common diseases that are really multifactorial. So if I were to stand back and I were to say what will happen for precision medicine broadly, I think that, that both the optimists and pessimists will see what they want to see. There'll be progress, but it'll be less than I think the most grandiose promises. It will still be much less. The next thing I want to say is that one of my worries here is not that I think we should take precision medicine and dig its grave and put it down and bury it. I think it's a real thing to study. I worry that it disproportionately consumes the biomedical resources. It takes too much funding. And when you fund one thing a lot, you don't give the money to lots of other things. You got to fund science broadly for the serendipity. You don't know where it's going to come. So I think that there will be some revolution. The people who are really clever will call that precision medicine, whatever it may be. They'll brand it. They'll take the credit because that's the politics of science. And then the last thing I'd say about this topic is population health. You can always hope and look for these new shiny tools, but we already know so many things about what will make people healthier. A built environment that allows people to exercise and walk to work and bike to work and commute. Better food choices that don't pump us full of processed salts and garbage. Better subsidies in the food industry. Campaigns to go from smoking where it is now to zero. The last mile of smoking has still resulted in massive numbers of deaths. I think what you see now, COVID-19, pandemic preparedness and scientific preparedness for whatever threat may loom. I would say if I were to define what happened to science in COVID-19, I would say we tore ourselves apart. I think we literally tore ourselves apart. Every day there's a new scientist who is said, ill-motivated, a bad person because they have some bad view. We have no system to referee different policy ideas. It's really, it's really sort of a free-for-all. I don't know I don't see healthy discourse in the community. I see vitriol and anger. We talked in the beginning of this podcast about that article I wrote. I guess I'm a little sore about it because I went on Twitter and people really, they called me lots of names. And I guess I want to say that I can understand you disagreeing with me. Like I can get that you think we should be more precautious. I can get that. I mean, I would disagree with you heartily, and I would argue to my death. But I can get that you disagree with me. But to assume that everyone who disagrees with us is a bad person, that's a poisonous belief, and it's everywhere in society, from politics to medicine to the news. If everybody who disagrees with you is not an expert and ill-motivated, you're going to be very lonely in life. Because the truth is, most people are gray. We're all complex people. But many people are trying to do their best in biomedicine. They have different conceptions of the good, and we have to, talk about it in a sober way. So I think that's my prediction for the future.
I think that's the saddest thing that's come out of this pandemic is we've lost our ability to thoughtfully disagree, to be constructive about these areas of disagreement. And like your book, Medical Reversal, says, 10 years from now, none of us is going to be entirely right. Some of us may be more right than others, but no one's going to be 100% right. And if we don't have those discussions and hear alternative viewpoints, we're never going to get it. And for politics, it's probably as bad as or worse as it is for science. So I hope we do some learning on that. Well, I share your perspective that in terms of precision medicine, I see some opportunities, but it may not pan out, or it may. And like so many things we do, it's going to be determined empirically and not necessarily. It's hard to know one way or the other. And I agree about diversification of our strategies, because if we put all our eggs in the precision medicine basket, we're going to miss out on so many other important opportunities that we might stumble upon.
Can I say one last thing about the precision medicine? Okay. One of the challenges that we're going to face is the universal blood-based cancer test. It's coming. There are a number of companies. There's so much money behind this effort. And what is this idea? This idea is that you draw my blood, and my blood will tell you that I have early pancreas cancer, I have early lung cancer, I have early GI cancer. It's going to tell you something like that. But what is it really telling you? Is it really making people better off? Is it really telling you I have early pancreas cancer? Or do I have advanced pancreas cancer, and so, it's just giving you lead time bias? That's a possibility. Other possibility is, it tells you I have earliest pancreas cancer. You scan me, you don't see anything. What are you going to do? Cut my pancreas out. It says I have early lung cancer. You don't see it. Where is it? Where do you cut? Do you take my whole left lobe out? My whole left lung out? My right lung? Both lungs? What do you take out? So I think the companies are investing here. There's a pilot at NHS in the UK where they're doing this in 50,000 people. There are going to be large, uncontrolled experiments as to what happens when you deploy this test. And there will be people who say that those experiments show we found X number of cancers, and that's bigger than what you'd expect. We found more cancer, and therefore we're saving lives, and you got to approve our test. And this company, they're going to come at us like a freight train to pay for this. But the truth is, they haven't proven you make us better off. To prove you make people better off, you have to randomly assign them to their test or not the test and show they live longer or live better. Finding cancer, cutting out organs, all this stuff, that doesn't prove you make people better off.
And there is precedent for your concern. We, got ahead of so many things, including cancer screening, like PSA screening, based on the studies that you describe right now, where you identify it, you take out prostates, but it doesn't actually lead to longer, healthier lives.
Absolutely.
Well, Vinay, the target audience for this podcast is the general lay public, and so
you should have led with that. I'm so sorry, Michael. I'm so sorry.
No, this was great. I think you did a nice job of distilling it at a level that people can understand. But my last question is, what advice would you give to a general listener, a patient of yours, for example, about genetic testing? Is there any test they should get now, or is this the kind of thing they should keep an eye on? What would you advise a patient or a general lay public member?
Yeah, I guess the first thing I would advise is I would just tell you the reality of medicine, which is that, newer isn't always better and more information isn't always good, but some information is essential. And I guess depending on where you are in your journey, from you're a healthy person, you want to stay well. If you're the old joke says, if you're a healthy person, you want to stay well, I think the best thing you can do is have a good personal relationship with the primary care doctor that you trust. And then otherwise, The less medicine, the better, Get out there, exercise, eat well. And you know what that is. It's not a surprise. Fruits, vegetables, get out there, be active, sleep more. Don't be so stressed out. Get off the computer, turn away the phones, everything your grandma would tell you, that's what you do. Okay. Then let me say you're somebody who you feel a symptom, you feel a lump, you feel a headache, you feel nose pain, you feel whatever, something that bothers you. Have that relationship so you feel comfortable talking to somebody about that. It's important to get those things checked out. I think you're not the best position, especially a lay public person, to know whether or not your ailment is serious. So take it seriously. Run it by somebody who's a thoughtful internist. That's why the relationship is so important, I think, because they know what is, something worth acting upon versus something not. And the last thing I'd say is you're somebody who's dealing with a disease, a complex disease, many diseases, perhaps even a disease that's very likely to be fatal, like cancer. I think more than anything, you need a doctor you trust.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Vinay Prasad, author of Ending Medical Reversal, most recently Malignant, host of the Plenary Session podcast. Please do check him out. A great person to follow on social media. And again, this is Dr. Michael Hochman, host of the Healthy Skeptic MD. Please do search and subscribe. Pass it along to family members who might be interested. We'll pick it up again next week.